Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. Unless I'm mistaken, there's only one passage in the New Testament where someone laughs, or there's ridicule that results in laughter, and that was when St. Paul visited my hometown of Athens. The impression the place made on him was not favorable. Acts tells us that he was disgusted at the number of statues and sort of cult idols that filled the city. At any rate, he was well known for having something original to say, so the philosophers who made up the Areopagus, a bunch of Stoics and Epicureans, invited him to give them a lecture. So he stands up before them, and he does something very interesting, which he says, well, as I was coming up here, I noticed that you have this altar to the unknown God. Right? So these are ancient Athenians. They want to have their bases covered, and they're like, okay, we've got temples and shrines to this god and that god and the other god, but hey, there might be some gods out there we missed, we don't know who they are, so we'll just put up an altar there to the unknown god. I think Pausanias, another visitor to Athens in the 2nd century, mentions something like this. At any rate, Paul gets up and he says, well, I'm here to tell you about that unknown God. And he launches into a speech which actually starts with ideas that wouldn't have been entirely unfamiliar to his audience of Athenian philosophers. In particular, he talks about this is the God who created the world. He talks about that, and this is a sort of invisible God. You don't need material objects to worship this God. I think that so far so good. The philosophers would have been able to follow that. But then it gets much more specifically Christian, and he refers to the requirement that everybody repent because God has fixed this day on which he will judge everybody. And the proof of this is the resurrection from the dead. And at this mention of raising the dead, everyone burst out laughing. This was not a God that they had heard of. I think Paul was right. This was unknown to the Athenians, and they weren't having any of it. Jump ahead 6 centuries or so to the calling of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia, at least as recorded in the Quran, and we find a different kind of situation. Muhammad is trying to get his fellow Arabians to worship Allah, and only Allah, and Allah is described as the creator of the heavens and the earth, and yet it seems that the sort of polytheists, right, the pagans, or whatever you want to call them, with whom he is in discussion, they already know Allah, and they understand that Allah is the creator. In fact, there are some surahs in the Quran where it says, if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will say Allah. And the response is, yes, so do you think that those gods, idols to which you pray, will help you if you have need? This happens in a couple of places, Surah 39, 43. The issue seems to be that there's a consensus about Allah, the creator, but then these polytheists, they go on and they worship all of these other gods. And the idea is to get them to stop doing that. There's no unknown God. It's not like St. Paul coming with this the unknown God who does things the audience has never heard of before and does not find plausible. So who was Allah before Muhammad? He's clearly been around for a while, but it's very difficult to know pre-Islamic Arabian religion. Roughly speaking, there are, apart from the Quran, 2 kinds of sources. There are the later Islamic sources. So these are written texts, sometimes centuries after the time of Muhammad. And so there's a question of, how whether they preserve pre-Islamic material, how it's been transmitted, and also that they are presenting, pre-Islamic Arabia in ways that make sense to them, centuries after Islam has come along. And then there are the inscriptions from all of the lands in which Arabic speakers lived and moved and traveled through for centuries before Islam. And my guest is here to tell you about those because that's where we're going to find not only a lot, but a great many other things. My guest is Ahmad Al-Jallad, who's a professor at Ohio State University, and he's done probably more than anybody to tease out, first of all, to track down, find, record, and publish, and then to tease out all the information that we can from pre-Islamic inscriptions in Arabia. He's the expert on the language and the scripts that these inscriptions are written in. But he also finds wonderful, wonderful things in them, such as, for example, how did they pronounce Greek? Because sometimes they would write in Greek as well. And so it's very important contributions to, let's say, the phonetics or the grammar of spoken Greek on the fringes of the desert in the provinces of sort of Syria, Palestine, that arc along which Arabic speakers moved in the period that we had the Roman Empire and late antiquity. These are people who sometimes very often appear in our written sort of Greek sources, but we can only know them really, their own thought world through the inscriptions that they wrote. And Ahmad is not only a phenomenal scholar, he's a stupendous speaker. And I was actually inspired to record this episode with him after he gave a talk here at Chicago, which was just one of the most amazing kinds of presentations that I have seen, and I've seen a lot. It's this command of the material, the enthusiasm that he exudes for speaking about it. He's just one of those speakers who makes you feel immersed in the sort of research project, this process of discovery, all the excitement of it. And the Q&A was even more impressive than the talk itself. Anyway, it was an absolute pleasure, and so was having him here on the podcast, as you're about to experience. Now, it takes us a little while to build up to the answer to the question of who Allah was before Islam, because first we want to talk about his work, the archaeological surveys that he conducts, what kinds of materials are these, what are the different schools of thought. So you'll have to listen through to the end. But it's worth it, and the article that he's working up on this isn't yet published, so this is where you get the news first. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here's my conversation with Ahmad. Ahmad, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
So among the many things that you do, I think it's fair to say that you're one of the world authorities on the ancient forms of the Arabic language. And let's talk a little bit about how we know about these languages. There's a lot of text to go through, and I think you spend most of your time going through these texts. But they're not exactly literary texts, like manuscripts that are preserved like from classical antiquity. So what is the kind of corpus of material that you study, and why did these folks, so we're talking about pre-Islamic Arabia, why did they write so much? What motivated them to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, I think we have to begin with what's in the popular imagination. When people think about pre-Islamic Arabia, especially those who are exposed to, let's say, the common stories about the environment out of which Islam emerged. Pre-Islamic Arabia is usually described as a sort of, as a colleague of mine once put it, a hermetically sealed biodome, where, for since time immemorial, you had these nomadic tribes who were illiterate and also had basically no contact with the outside world, roaming around and warring with each other and, well, being, in this very basic sense, primitive. And so it was thought that any knowledge that we could derive about Arabia before Islam would have to come from sources that were preserved between quotations, scare quotations, or produced in the Islamic period. Mm-hmm. Because there was simply no evidence. There was nothing written. These were illiterate people. And we do have a wealth of information about pre-Islamic Arabia, its history, but also its languages or the kinds of Arabic that were spoken there that come from the early Islamic period, from the 8th century at the earliest, 9th century, it becomes really abundant. And when you look at this kind of material, you get an idea of a very homogeneous Arabia. The entire peninsula is speaking basically one language, which is Arabic, except in the southwestern corner, there seems to be another language that Arab grammarians called and historians called Himyaritic, but the examples of the language they gave make it look simply as an exotic Arabic dialect, not really a different language as such. And so the idea that Arabia was Arabic from the very beginning of time is what emerges from these sources. And for, I would say, 1,200 years, uh, that is the opinion that was dominant. That was the consensus. That's what people worked with. That's what they thought was a reflection of historical reality. And then in the 19th century, European explorers began to wander around the Arabian Peninsula, and they took notice of a very interesting phenomenon. See, Arabia, again, in the popular imagination, there's no writing, it's illiterate, but one that did not square with what they were seeing in the landscape. Almost everywhere they went, the rocks were covered with writing. And not writing in the Arabic script from the Islamic period, that's expected, but rather writings in mysterious scripts that were at the time undeciphered. And these writings basically covered boulders all along West Arabia, where you have these great sandstone outcrops and mountains, and even on granite, you'll find these inscriptions. Hundreds and hundreds, and then hundreds became thousands, and thousands became 10,000s, tens of thousands. There's more and more texts. But as you said, this is not a book culture. These are not manuscripts. These are what we would call today graffiti. They're carvings on rock. They're very short. And at this time, again, they were undeciphered. And so these early explorers, encountering this undeciphered material, they put upon these inscriptions the very, let's say, exciting label Thamudic. And Thamudic is named after a tribe, Thamud, which is one of the tribes in the Quran that is said to be destroyed by Allah, the God, for disobedience. So it's a lost. In Arabic tradition, there's a just as in you most of our listeners might be aware of the lost tribes of Israel. There are also the lost tribes of Arabia. The Quran talks about a few of these, and one of the lost tribes of Arabia is Thamud. These researchers, these early explorers, decided that these inscriptions were by Thamud, and they got the label Thamudic. As the scripts were slowly deciphered, it was clear that they were not. Let's say we could not prove or really make an argument even that they were by a tribe Thamud, which is a historical tribe, but not by them. But one of the more interesting things that came out of the study of this material is that many of the languages these texts concealed were, well, some of them were close to Arabic, but not the Arabic we know because they are much earlier. And some of them were not in Arabic at all. In fact, what these graffiti preserve is a lost linguistic landscape. Okay, a diverse spectrum of Semitic languages that had all gone extinct, that have no modern descendants. We don't know what the speakers of these languages called their languages. In fact, most of these languages we only know through these very fragmentary texts. So we can't really say very much about their grammar, except that they're not Arabic as we know it. And the chronology of these texts is very unclear as well, because, as you know, rock inscriptions cannot be, carbon dated. And most of these texts, their authors decide they did not do a good job of telling us when they were writing. They weren't writing them for us, so they didn't mention the year. Some of the earliest references that you find in these texts, they might reference outside events, like, for example, the conquests of Nabonidus, the Babylonian king in Arabia in the 6th century BCE. So that's, it's quite early, 6th century BCE. They were produced, probably the earliest of them, in the early first millennium BCE. And the writing tradition continues until probably the 4th or 5th century AD. And at that moment, it is replaced by the Arabic script and Arabic language that we would be familiar with. Yeah.
But most of the inscriptions that you study, the pre-Islamic ones, are in a version of Arabic.
The let's say all of this material is interesting. Let's put it that way. But subjectively speaking, the most interesting corpus is actually not coming from Central Arabia or West Arabia. The most interesting corpus, in my opinion, is found in the desert region east of Hauran. Hauran being a mountains region on the border of Syria and Jordan. So near Bostra, if you south of Damascus. So it is, and to the east of there, you have a basalt desert. That is a black desert with large boulders of basalt. And the people who inhabited this desert some 2,000 years ago, and even earlier, maybe 2,500 years ago, we've got to be flexible with these dates. They were prolific writers, and they produced tens of thousands of texts that we know about. And the dialects that they wrote in are indeed what we would call dialects of Old Arabic. Yeah.
So what I love about what you do is that, for most people to study old text, you go into a library, but you go out into the fields in the desert.
It,
And
it,
yeah, you're doing a kind of landscape textuality, which I find fascinating. And I think every late Roman historian recognizes that the area that you're describing, this arc, right, that's like just on the border of the hinterland of the cities of use of Jordan and Syria, just around the desert, was inhabited by Arabic speakers throughout all of late antiquity, whom our Greek and Roman sources call Saracens. And they're not being too picky about the term. Just used it to refer collectively to everybody in there. And we send people like you in there to sort it all out. So can you so you spend a lot of time as a field archaeologist tracking these inscriptions down in Jordan and Arabia. Can you tell us about the kind of terrain that you're working in and where you find the inscriptions in that terrain?
yes. So the terrain is very harsh, and it is not a place you can take chariots out into and wheeled vehicles. No, it's really difficult to access. It's obviously very arid, so you need a local guide who's going to show you where water sources are. And in many ways, you are beyond the authorities of settled areas when you're out there. But that doesn't mean so the Harra, this area is called the Harra in Arabic. It's a hilly landscape. It's hill country, where you have these wadis, we'll say seasonal rivers. So in the rainy season, it'll rain, and these seasonal rivers will fill up with water, and you'll get abundant herbage, and it's fantastic for nomadic pastoralists. They'll come and bring their animals and so forth. Um, and in the summer, there's still, even when I go out there in June, there's still remnants of herbage. It's not completely uh, barren,
Yeah.
but it is incredibly harsh. So we do our because, as as academics, we have to teach during the good times of the year, which means in the summer is where we do our research, our field work. So we go out there in July, June, late June, early July, and the temperatures are yeah, very easily 100 between 105, 110 Fahrenheit, sometimes 115 Fahrenheit, very rarely, but sometimes 115 Fahrenheit. But that's not the point. The point is you're there. There are no trees in this landscape. There's no shade. All right. You have to pitch your own tent. There's no shade, very little water. But in addition to that, you are standing on black stones. The entire
Mm,
landscape is covered with black stones, and these reflect the heat.
mm,
So at some moments, it really feels like you're out there in a sauna.
mm,
It's a very, very tough landscape, and it's incredible. And there's this one site in Jawa, which is in northern Jordan. There was a site there, I guess it was a Roman fort, and there's a lovely Greek inscription there. I can't remember it verbatim, but it's by the Greek inscription, Greek graffito, written by two miserable city boys, we could say, that were taken out with a Roman troop. One was a musician, the other was a barber. And I guess they were taken out there to kind of entertain and take care of the captain or what have you. And they wrote basically, life is nothing for this guy, the musician and the barber in this terrible place. And it was basically the most horrible experience that you could imagine, going from, Bosra, or one of these lovely places in the southern Levant, out to this very harsh environment. So it wasn't a place that many settled people wanted to be. But it did afford the inhabitants of the region with a kind of freedom. They were outside of the control of settled areas. Of course, they weren't paying taxes, but it doesn't mean that they were completely isolated from these people. There are a lot of connections. Yeah,
sure. I mean, you're mostly walking in the footsteps of pastoral, nomadic groups, right?
that's right. Yeah.
And So they're leaving behind this trail of inscriptions that you're finding.
That's right.
So what kinds of texts are these, and why are they filling the landscape with them?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So how they learn to write? Because, immediately what I think most scholars of the ancient world would find to be surprising is that a nomadic population that has no need for, kind of written administration, record keeping, this kind of business, why would they have a writing tradition? What do they need writing for? And the circumstances to how writing reached them is very unclear. So Michael MacDonald, great scholar of this material, put out a hypothesis that the nomads sort of casually picked up writing at some point in the past by imitating what they saw settled people doing. So they would go to oases and they would say, see settled people using writing for practical purposes, like, record keeping and so forth. And they would say, what are you doing? And they would teach them the alphabet. This is how it works. And then they would go back to the deserts and deploy writing for whatever purposes they did there. And so some scholars think they were just doing it for a pastime or what have you, but I think it was a bit more serious. I don't know if we can't answer for sure how writing reached them, but they're writing in a script that belongs to a family of indigenous alphabets in Arabia, called the South Semitic script. It is a sister script to Phoenician and Aramaic, a sister script ultimately to Greek, of course. It doesn't descend from Phoenician, one of the only alphabets traditions that doesn't descend from Phoenician. It rather shares a common ancestor with Phoenician. All
Oh.
right. And it proliferated throughout Arabia. There are many, many of these alphabet types that we call South Semitic. And the alphabet used in the area we're discussing is called Safayidic. This is just a modern term, right? These are modern inventions. The authors who use the nomads who use the Safayidic script, Safayidic writing nomads, we could say, once they acquired writing, they basically augmented many of their cultural practices with writing. So, for example, in ancient times, they would grieve for the dead, they would bury the dead, and one of the rituals they had would be laying a stone on the grave of the dead
Mm.
or on the cairn of the dead, contributing to the building of the cairn of the dead, right, by putting a stone. Once these nomads acquired writing, they would inscribe these stones so that the ritual of putting the stone on the grave of the dead wasn't simply an act of an anonymous memorial act, but right now the stone actually bore a record of not only the name of the deceased, but also it recorded the emotions of of basically the dead's loved ones.
Yeah.
So you might find at a cairn of a dead man, so and so will say, he will take the stone and he will say he built upon so and he grieved for so and so, his
Mm.
beloved, and what have you. And so he'll record his grief and he'll put it on the stone. So you can see in that case a very ancient mortuary ritual had been augmented by writing. And because it was augmented by writing, now we have some insights into basically the cult, their funerary culture. Other text the corpus in general is very religious. We can put it crudely.
Mm.
It's very concerned that most of the materials in the inscriptions, most of the events that are mentioned are dangerous events and dangerous circumstances. So, for example, going on raids, engaging in long distance migrations, pasturing. Pasturing is, people think pasturing is, they don't tend to understand how dangerous that activity is. You're by yourself with all of these animals that not only all the predators want, like lions, but also enemy tribes want.
Right.
And so, it's quite a dangerous activity. And it's these circumstances that motivate authors to write inscriptions. So the inscription would go something like this: by so and so, son of so and so. They almost always write in the third person. And he pastured the camels or the sheep or what have you. So, and then a prayer. Oh Allat, this goddess, or oh Dushara, the another god, may he be secure. May he be secure from enemies. May he have abundance, so on and so forth.
Mm.
And this type of inscription is very, very common. So if you read the entire corpus, you get the feeling that these people were a very depressed lot. All they talk about is the rain's not coming, being worried about enemies and raids. But in fact, it is those very activities and circumstances that are motivating them to write.
Yeah.
There seems to be this idea that if you wrote it down, um, you're making a prayer. Obviously, there were oral prayers, but by writing down that oral prayer, it can be communicated, far beyond the moment of utterance. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll pick up on religion in just a second, but when you were
Yeah.
speaking about what they first did with the script when they got a hold of it.
Yeah.
So I just remembered, what did the Greeks do with their script once they got a hold of it? Well, they could have done things like write down Homer, fine. But I remember up on the mountain on the island of Santorini, so ancient Thera,
Yeah.
there are these rock carved graffiti, exactly the same thing, where from very, very early on, this is like very soon after the invention of the Greek script, where they're all recording who had sex with whom.
Oh, oh my. I have to tell you, so I worked on during COVID, I had a sort of a COVID project. There's a corpus of inscriptions called Thamuric D. And Thamuric D, it's one of these from
Yeah.
further south in Arabia. It was partially deciphered, not fully deciphered, not fully understood. It's still the corpus was very small that I had a hold of too, and I didn't have enough material to actually complete the full decipherment of the script. But I was able to make some progress. So I think we can understand most of the inscriptions now. There's still some letters that are not understood. And
Mm.
so the question is, what is concealed behind these mysterious texts? And indeed, once I was able to identify with the sound K, it turned out that they were all talking about having sex as
Okay.
well. Same story. All it was so much having sex, and and sometimes even advice. There was one inscription that said simply, "Do not have sex with the slave girl of the
Yes,
sky
yes, yes,
goddess."
yes.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And you say, okay, so that is, the great mystery that we unlock when we decipher these scripts
Yes.
sometimes.
There are graffiti exactly like that from Pompeii.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yes,
Yes.
do not sleep with so
Advice.
and so. Yes.
Incredible. Yeah.
All right. So here's a practical question I have for you.
Yeah.
So you're out there, you're in the desert, you're looking for these things. So
Mm.
if you come across an inscription, how do you know that it hasn't already been transcribed and published, or that maybe you came across it in an
Yeah.
early season? Like, how do you know? Is there a database that you're checking them against in real time?
Yeah, so in former times is very difficult because these inscriptions were just published in very random places. There was
Yeah.
no, complete bibliography, so sometimes you had no idea. In the mid 90s, Michael McDonald, in collaboration with Leila Na'meh, produced the first, what they called the Safietic database online, where they made a database of the published inscriptions, the major collections that were known so far. So that helped. And then about 20 years later, Michael McDonald obtained a research grant from the British government to basically build on that. And the project was called Oceana, the online corpus for the inscriptions of ancient North Arabia. And that project, at its conclusion, I think, saw the digitization of something like 35,000 texts, which is a drop in the pond.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. And so you can check with that, but the problem is that database is only accurate as the data you put into it. And what was discovered by my colleague Ali Al-Manasir, is a Jordanian colleague who's busy on the desert too, is a lot of these editions that are published that are saying texts are from certain places. The provenances were all messed up. And when you actually rediscover these texts, you realize they're actually not from the place
Hmm.
that was reported in the original publication. Many of these original texts obviously were pre-GPS dates, so you just have sort of a general region where you might find them. So it's really a lot of work. But right now, and then in 2000, last year actually, Oceana was at Oxford until last year, but the project ended in 2017, I think it was, and it ran out of money, so there was no possibility to update it. And
Hmm.
then we moved it to OSU, where now it is open again, and we're updating it daily. And so it can be found at Oceana, Oceana at osu.edu.
Okay.
And that is basically the primary international repository for these inscriptions.
Okay.
But again, it's a work in progress.
Oh, sure.
So it depends sometimes. Sometimes, you're out in the field and you come across a text it's like meeting an old friend or someone not even an old friend. Sometimes it's like meeting someone you met only once and they seem
Yes.
familiar. You're like, I
Yes.
know you. I've
I know
met you
you from somewhere.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And then you've got to go back and find out where. Yeah.
Yes.
But it's
Where have
but
we
most
met?
of the texts that you will find have not been studied, have not been published. So just to give a kind of example of what we're looking at and how open this field is, how exciting this field is. The Oceana database now available to the public, it has about 46,000 texts. The back end, these are unedited texts, has about 50,000. But over the last 10 years, uh, we have been doing yearly surveys in Jordan, just in Jordan. Um, Ali Manasir, my collaborator, tells me he counted these all up. The amount of photographs that we have taken over the last 10 years has reached 450,000,
Mm,
which must represent at least 100,000 new texts.
mm.
So you're talking about, so we have 50,000 in there, but there are 100,000 unstudied photographs in our
Right.
hard drives. And that is still a fraction of what's out there. Yeah.
Right. So everything that we're going to say from here on out about the religion of pre-Islamic Arabia is provisional. It's tentative.
There are some things that are more secure than others. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Because you're in a field where just opening the right box and pulling out whatever, it can just change the framework altogether.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. All
Yeah.
right. So let's talk a little bit about that. And let's go back to the image that you presented of what most people think pre-Islamic Arabia was like. And one of the questions that a lot of people have is what was the religious scene in pre-Islamic Arabia? And this is the kind of culture, the matrix from which the Quran and Islam emerged. Now, the literary sources from the Islamic period, so maybe a couple centuries after the Prophet and so forth, they give the impression that Arabia is this polytheistic place,
Yeah.
and that the Arabs sort of had to be converted from polytheism to Islamic monotheism. But we know from other sources there are also, of course, Jews and Christians there too. So what does this epigraphic corpus that you study, what does it suggest for let's say the couple of centuries before Islam appears?
Yeah. Uh, so I work in Jordan, which is very far away from the epicenter
Mm,
of Islamic origins. But I have also surveyed and worked in West Arabia, in the Hijaz. I've surveyed at Mecca. I mean, not in the middle of the city because there's nothing there. It's all, it's a modern city, but in the surrounding areas. I've worked in Taif, which is a very important site to the east of Mecca. Okay. And I've worked in the areas in between, and I have projects in mind of what to do next. So I've worked at the epicenter of Islam. I've also worked in the northern Hijaz, northern West Arabia, up to Tabuk, even up to the border of Jordan. I've gone as far north as the border of Jordan. Um, what's what's immediately important to realize is that Arabia, as a single kind of landmass, a culturally homogenous landmass, is not something that exists in the very early period, right? These are very different places and different peoples and different languages we've said, so we can generalize. But by the time we get to uh, the decades before the rise of Islam, late seventh, sixth century, early seventh century, let's say, Arabia is becoming more and more culturally unified, linguistically unified. There is more of an Arabia that we might
mm,
recognize, right? The traditional sources or the sources that we get in Islamic yeah, literary materials, I like to call folklore. Okay. It is the reason why is because it's not actually based, those stories are not based on manuscripts that go back to the pre-Islamic period. They're not based on the study of artifacts from the pre-Islamic period. They're based on reports, stories, hearsay. And a lot of these are legendary. There was a pre-Islamic Arabia became sort of a fad in the ninth century, and people wanted to know a lot about it. and there was a lot of currency in having good stories about pre-Islamic Arabia.
Mm.
One of the things for me that sort of set off my, let's say, spider sense is when you read about pre-Islamic Arabian religion in Islamic sources, there's something really interesting missing. There's no, um, there are no stories. So they mention what they will do is they'll say in pre-Islamic times, and this is the Arabia to which out of which Islam emerged, is that the Prophet around him, his opponents and all this were rampant polytheists worshiping many, many gods. Okay, just this very crude idea of polytheism, right? They're worshiping many, many gods and everything. But what's interesting and what made me feel suspicious immediately before I even started going deep into the material evidence was that there are no Islamic sources that ever communicate to us a mythology.
Mm.
These gods are just names. And sometimes they mention rituals, very, very generic stereotype rituals associated with them, like, slaughtering animals for them, putting blood on their cult stone, this kind of thing. Okay, very, very generic rituals. But there are no stories about them. There are no mythologies. Like how do these gods relate to each other? What is their role in the cosmos? What is the pantheon? Nothing. They're just names. And so for me, that was the number one thing that kind of set things off. That seemed unlikely that there was a that pre-Islamic, let's call it ancestral Arabian religion, was preserved, or at least knowledge of it was preserved to the ninth century intact. Because if indeed in the 6th century there was full-blown ancestral Arabian religion where they surely had mythologies, they surely had ideas of what these gods do, it was
Hmm.
all forgotten. It was
Hmm.
all completely forgotten. Okay, but then when you realize that it must have all been forgotten, then that opens up the question of what else was forgotten. Or in other words, you can put it a different way. Forget about forgetting. How was that period? Perhaps we need to ask, how was it constructed?
Right.
Right? We're not even talking about memory here. We're talking about active construction. How was it constructed? And the thing for me, the second thing that alerted me to, or motivated me sort of to uh, let's say, think more creatively about this material is that one of the most popular books that you have about this, and there's paganisms and pre-Islamic Arabian religions everywhere, but one of the most popular books is the book by an antiquarian called Ibn al-Kalbi, okay? And it's called The Book of Idols. But the material in there you can find in stories about the Prophet, you can find it everywhere. Um, and he lists all the idols that the ancient Arabs used to worship, the gods. He doesn't really make a different distinction between gods, idols, statues. It's all just one
Right.
thing in use interchangeably. And for me, what was fascinating is the only deities that are in that list that we can actually verify in the archaeological record are the ones that are mentioned in the Quran. And everything else on that list, there's just no trace of them anywhere
Huh.
at all. It's all so the only thing that's actually historically verifiable is the deities in the Quran that are mentioned in the Quran. The Quran mentions seven deities or
Right.
eight deities, sorry, eight deities, but in different ways, in only two instances. And everything else is just not there. All the other deities that this Ibn al-Kalbi mentions, they're just not there in the archaeological record. So it's really, really interesting. With one exception, there's a deity called Rodo, which he correctly guesses is a deity because he knew people called Abd Rodo, or it's in the genealogies, which means servant of Rodo. And he correctly guessed that if you have servant of something, the thing must be theophoric. It must be a theophoric name. But that's it. And I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so what's going on? Well, when we look at the kind of paganism that's in the popular imagination, it is absolutely there in the Sophiatic inscriptions. I mean, they are worshiping dozens, many, many, many gods. And they're doing all the things that you expect pagans to do. They're going on pilgrimages, they're making sacrifices, they're doing libations, burnt offerings, they're doing all the fun stuff.
Sure.
The trouble is the Safvidic culture, the culture associated with that kind of those kinds of inscriptions, seems to end maybe 4th century, 5th century at best. It's
Mm.
gone. It's really gone. And in the inscriptional stratigraphy, we can see that all the inscriptions that are sort of after the 5th century across Arabia are not attesting these ancient deities anymore. So the Safavidic guys, they will invoke in one inscription 10 deities, no problem. We'll call on all of them. And some of them will just say, I'm calling upon every god in the sky,
Right.
all of them. In the 5th century, 6th century, and obviously 7th, they only call upon one God, only one God. And that God, depending on where you are or who you are, if you're a Christian, that God is called Al-Ilah. And Al-Ilah is basically the Arabic translation of Hotheos. It looks like, and it's in the God, and
The
that
God.
occurs only in Greek, in Christian inscriptions.
Right.
So that makes complete sense. And then if you're not overtly Christian, I mean, if you don't have crosses on your inscriptions and so forth, you're still calling upon only one God. But the God you're calling upon is Allah. And they spelled it in different ways. They didn't have a stable orthography, but it's clearly Allah. That's the only one they call upon. So in that sense, and I've said this, and I've said this before, and people have misinterpreted it, but it's important. The inscriptions are monotheistic before Islam, all of them. Monotheistic in the sense that they invoke only one deity. And that is significant because before the 4th century, the same kinds of inscriptions would invoke many deities.
Including Allah.
Allah can be invoked with them too. Yes, he was certainly there. He was certainly there. But he was invoked beside other gods, beside other gods as well. But in the 5th century, 6th century, it's just him and nobody else.
So some colleagues on my side of things, Polimni Athanasiadi, Michael Frede, had published this book. I think I'm getting it, so I'm just remembering it now, so maybe I'm making a mistake in the attribution. It was called pagan monotheism in
Yes,
late.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
is that a concept
I
that
know that book.
applies
Yeah.
here? I mean, you
Yeah,
might be invoking one God. It doesn't mean that you don't believe or recognize others, right?
yeah, yeah. The great scholar of Islamic origins, Patricia Crona, took that material and applied it to the Islamic situation and argued that indeed these could be pagan monotheists and so forth. And yeah, I mean, that's if well, let's look at it in a different way. See, the thing that complicates this whole story is the Quranic text. So we'll talk about the Quranic text in a minute, but let's just look at the material evidence. If we looked at the material evidence, the inscriptions themselves, and as you know the situation very well in South Arabia in the 4th century and the 5th century, you have a movement towards a kind of monotheism, whether
Hmm.
it's Judaizing monotheism, whether it's pagan, I mean, there's many ways, but it is clearly a monotheism.
Hmm.
If we use the material evidence alone, just the material evidence, that transformation that happened in South Arabia has to be applied to the entirety of West Arabia, including West Arabia, the environs of
Hmm.
Mecca, Medina, what
Hmm.
have you, right?
Yeah.
In other words, the material evidence suggests that this monotheistic transformation had happened basically across Arabia, which makes complete sense historically, politically, and so forth, right? It's
Yes.
not hard to understand.
Mhm.
The thing that forces us to I think, nuance this reconstruction is the Quranic text. Now, the Quran is a witness to early 7th century West Arabia. And at least the parts of the Quran that are describing things in Mecca, they're talking about these Meccans honoring other super beings, all right, that are not Allah. And it names them, Allat, Manat, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And these are the names of Nabatean goddesses.
Right.
So they're not, these are real things, right? They were at least at some point goddesses. Um, Fine. It talks about them, doing sacrifices on cult stones. It talks about the pilgrimage. It talks about all of these ancient pagan rituals that we see our Safavidic guys doing.
Right.
But so that image that the Quran is presenting is not an image we see in the inscriptions at all.
It's a bit archaic.
It's very archaic. In other words, the Quran looks like it's talking to guys who disappeared centuries earlier,
Right.
if we go from the material evidence.
Right.
So there is a so it's a fascinating puzzle because I don't I don't believe in throwing evidence out. I think ultimately these are all different perspectives on the same world.
Right.
They're all looking at the same world. Why does that world look different based on the kind of medium? And that's the trick to solve. I have ideas. I'm working on a paper now about this with a colleague, and I mean, I think ultimately we can make sense of a lot of it, but there are still problems out there that don't lend themselves to an easy explanation.
Sure.
Lots of it can be resolved by basically nuancing what we mean by polytheism, understanding the Quran as being rhetorical and polemic in many ways. That's fine. But there's one problem I'll share with you now. This is something we've discussed in our paper, Haytham Sidqi and I, that we're exploring. Um, the Quran says that the opponents of the Prophet did not believe in bodily resurrection. So they did not believe forget the matter of the afterlife, but that after they die, that God will resurrect them and judge
Hmm.
them.
Hmm.
And that they did not ask God for forgiveness. In this moment, there's a word called ghafara, istighfar. These pagan opponents of Muhammad did not ask God for forgiveness. This was not part of it because they were not going to be judged. What did they need forgiveness for, right?
Right.
The Quran is very clear in engaging its opponents this way. The problem is, right near Mecca, we have pre-Islamic inscriptions of people asking for forgiveness, istighfar.
Right.
So again, this is a real interesting problem. And we can
Mm.
always say, well, you got to understand only the people who were, believing in in the right way, who were monotheized, could write. And the real pagans, they couldn't write, but that doesn't make much sense because just a couple of centuries earlier, all the pagans were writing. How did the pagans forget to write? So, so there is a real problem here. It's a fascinating one. I don't know if we have enough data to solve it. I don't know, but yeah,
Okay, so maybe let's, for the purposes of this discussion,
yes,
maybe try to reverse engineer what might have happened here by looking at the character of Allah, the God, a God, the God,
yeah,
before the Quran.
yeah.
Because it's not as if the Quran proclaims something completely new and unfamiliar, right, to its audience. It's using existing, ideas and beliefs in some degree. So if we sort of control for that testimony and try to see what did people in this part of Arabia or wherever they, prayed to Allah, how did they understand that deity, right? And so there are a number of models here that you discuss. I mean, in your lecture that I saw here and in your paper. What are the main models?
So the question of the pre-Islamic Allah it's attracted a lot of attention in recent scholarship. Um, the I mean, classical Muslim scholars, just reading the Quran, the thing you realize immediately, and this is something that's discussed in classical Muslim scholarship and in modern historical critical approaches to the text as well, is that Muhammad's opponents basically agreed with him that Allah was the creator of the heavens and the earth. Okay, they agreed with him on that.
Mm.
And they also agreed with him that there were seven heavens. It's interesting. Okay. But he was a creator of the heavens and the earth. They seem to agree largely on the cosmology, right? What they seem to disagree with is let's say, Jewish patriarchs. They didn't seem to have any regard for the Jewish patriarchs. They seem to call biblical stories fables of the ancients. Or stories of the ancients, and it's some kind of pejorative way of referring to them, asatir. Um, they also disagree on this idea of resurrection and that judgment, right? That's something that they don't agree with. But they do agree that Allah is the main deity and that, or the creator deity. They agree on that. And they seem to agree on the manner of creation, cosmology. In other words, the Quran is never debating with the, with the mushrikeen, the opponents of Muhammad, about how creation proceeded. God's description of him as like light, he's the light of the heavens and the earth and all this. Those don't seem to be points of contention. The points of contention are let's say more subtle. So this motivated someone like Gerald Hawting, who's a fantastic scholar, looked at this material, and he basically said, well, look, I mean, ultimately this just comes down to a disagreement between monotheists.
Hmm.
The opponents of Muhammad were monotheistic, and but they were just agreeing on, the role of other super beings in the cosmos. The opponents of Muhammad believed that you could ask other subordinate super beings for intercession. And that, yeah, they weren't very happy with resurrection either. They didn't really believe that your body is going to be put back together. Right? That's something they couldn't say. Patricia Crona built on that. I said yes. And she said, well, look, they seem to be engaged in angel worship. They understood these ancient deities as angels and as intercessors and so forth. But it was really, yes, we're talking about degrees of monotheism.
This
Uh,
is very similar to debates between Christian theologians and Neoplatonists and
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And so that's treated a bit in Krona's work, of course. And then but then you have a pushback. You have a very, very clear thinker, really, 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 I think, insightful scholar, Aziz Al-Azmi, Professor Aziz Al-Azmi. He wrote a fantastic, very, very challenging book on on the origins of Islam in late antiquity, focusing on the character of Allah. And you may have it probably in that in your library, indeed. Um,
yes,
and
I have read it, though
yeah, yeah,
it was hard going.
it's challenging, but it's filled with great ideas. So I had the privilege of I got a personal sharh, an explanation of it, and many of the parts of it by Professor Azmi himself, which I appreciated. So I was like, yeah, what
Okay,
do you mean here? What do you mean there? So it's a very
exactly.
interesting idea. There's lots of very good ideas in there, but what he argued in that book is that yes, Allah is pre-Islamic. He is attested in pre-Islamic times, but he says, well, Allah was not a deity with a mythology and a defined character. It was sort of a generic term to talk about the God you are worshiping at the moment,
Okay.
the God that you are presently
Yeah.
worshiping. And it was very remote and things of this sort too. And in fact, it was Muhammad's uh, uh, theological project that promoted this divine name that into the God par excellence, the monotheistic God. Okay. The thing that challenges all of these debates, really, and how the Meccans or the Arabian pagans would have received or understood their ideas in relation to monotheistic folks like Christians and Jews, rests upon what the personality of Allah was in pre-Islamic times. And we just simply had no evidence. I mean, we have the Quran, but then in addition to that, we have what? We have some few inscriptions. So, for example, you get in Nabatean inscriptions Allah as part of personal names. Taymallahi, Garmallahi, so servant of Allah. But it doesn't tell you anything theologically. You don't know who this. Okay, you have one inscription from South Central Saudi Arabia, Qaryat al-Faw, the site. It's a grave inscription, and the guy who builds the grave calls upon a god called Kahal, and then Allah, and then another god, Athar al-Sharik. This is a manifestation of Venus. So these three gods to protect the grave. So Allah is mentioned among two other gods, and it seems that that's not compatible with the idea of the god I'm worshiping at the moment.
Right.
It really looks like
Distinct
he's a discrete
personality.
character. Yeah, discrete personality. He's a part of a triad, a divine triad there. Um, but what can you do with material like that? What can you do with it? There's one Safvidic inscription that was known. Um, it was discovered I think it was in the 50s. It was discovered, but it wasn't properly translated until I treated it in 2015. And the inscription is very interesting. It is by a man who was just made a military commander. So when he got promoted to be a military commander, he had to do some religious rituals. The first thing he did was aslay and made a burnt offering. And then he made an oath. So it's all very biblical here. It's very nice. So he makes an oath and he swears his oath by Allah. And the epithet of Allah here is who is living. So Allah the living. Very, again, biblical. But this is
Yeah.
in the Safavidic context. This is not in any monotheistic context.
Uh,
Allah is invoked in Safavidic and he gets invoked beside all the other gods too. He's just one of them, but he's rare. They don't call upon him very much.
Right, not the most popular one.
He's not the most popular. He shows up every once in a while, but he's not the most popular. So just to give you an idea, the most popular deity is Alat. This is a female deity, probably Venus. She is evoked more than 1,400 times in the corpus. Allah reaches 40 times. So
Right.
that gives you kind of an idea of popularity in terms of invocations. But this last season, and this is again when we talk about this library. So we have this library, we have this open air library.
Open air
It is a
library, yes.
library, it is a library from 2000 years ago, and we don't know everything that's in it. This is the exciting thing. So we wander around this library, pulling volumes to see what we get. And there's just so much. And last summer, and actually a text I'm publishing now. It should be out this year with the Journal of Semitic Studies. Um, I discovered a very interesting text that it's a funerary text and it's very, very poetic. But we'll talk very briefly about what makes the text interesting is that when you get to the invocation, the author calls upon Allah, which is already very rare, just Allah. And then he asks Allah for nur. And nur is light. And why is that strange? Well, because the Safavidic authors, they call upon their gods all the time, but they always ask them for very practical things: security, booty, vengeance, abundance of herbage, good animals. This is the first time in the entire corpus that something abstract like light
Hmm.
is being requested. It's just, what is this? And it's nur, and it's the exact same word, the exact same construction that you get in Quranic let's say you could find it wouldn't be an objectable Islamic statement. Allahu Nur, right? God is light, right? It's very, very interesting. Same word used in the Quran. And then at the end of the invocation, he asks God, he invokes Allah by an epithet which is Dhu Khalaqa, the one who created. So he gives Allah the epithet of the one who created. So he is the one who gives light and he is the one who created. So we know from this text that the creator God, or that Allah is the creator God, using this very specific Arabic word for creation, which is khalaqa, and that somehow part of one of the characteristic things that Allah does is he gives light, which of course recalls Genesis 1. I
Hmm.
mean, this is what God says, let there be light, and this idea of dividing light from darkness. This is one of the acts, one of the primary acts of creation, the act of splitting and division. And in fact, the Arabic word khalaqa, to create, literally means to split or divide. Okay, so this is a fantastic example. And what we have here is that this person here, we know, even though he's calling only on Allah in this inscription, this particular author wrote 8 other texts where he was happy to call on other gods. So he's not some monotheist. This is, in fact, the character of Allah as the creator deity within the polytheistic ancestral Arabian pantheon.
Right. But I mean, this is an interesting situation where you have a creator God who's nevertheless not the one most commonly invoked,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So how do you, I, in a monotheistic context, so for Christians and Muslims and so forth, that doesn't seem to make much sense.
yeah,
But in an
yeah,
ancient context, it does.
absolutely, yes. And I
So
mean, why does it make sense?
why does it make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think you have ideas about that, yes?
Well, I mean, in many ancient mythologies, um, the the deities that are principally worshipped are not the ones to whom the fundamental acts of creation are attributed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And in some
absolutely.
cases, it might be someone way further down the chain, as it
Yeah,
were. Um,
absolutely.
and sometimes the original creator gods are they're sort of iffy in some ways. They're remote. They're less being more distant from human beings. They're less,
Yeah.
you can't engage with them that much. Like something like Kronos, right? Who's like
Yes, yes, yes.
enemy of Zeus, like I mean his father, but also someone who
Yeah.
would be deposed. Like there's generations of gods.
Yes.
And so there's this
Yes.
kind of like this ultimate background figure, but yeah,
Yeah.
you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that applies for the ancestral Arabian context as well, that he's not. He's there, and in the corpus of 50,000 texts that he gets invoked 40 times is, I think, good evidence that he's quite remote indeed. Yeah, and but there are certain cases what I think is very, very interesting. So there is the storm deity, the weather deity, Baal Shemin. So
Mm.
it's one of manifestation, Baal Hadad, okay? So he's a storm deity. Now he doesn't always do his job. Droughts happen. And you have a very, very nice inscription where the guy is grieving in a drought because Baal Samin is absent. So then he turns to Allah and asks for rain. And I don't know if that's just an accident or because it's just one text, but it's fun to think that, you've got to go to the big guy.
I'm
If
going
this,
over his head. Yeah.
yeah, I've got to go all the way to the top. This is not working out. The guy who's supposed to be bringing the reins is not doing his job. I've got to go to his father or his boss or whatever the relationship is.
Yeah.
So I think it's absolutely fascinating in that sense. So that might be what's happening there in the Safavidic context. So he's the creator God, he's shining light, he's doing all this business, and the inscription is much, much more interesting than that. There's that second line in between the two phrases that we'll save that for the article because that's
Yeah.
a very, very, very complicated thing to treat, but very interesting. Now, the fact is here you have this idea of God, of Allah as the creator, as the light giver, as the splitter of creation. And you imagine a pagan, a practitioner of ancestral Arabian religion, meeting a monotheistic missionary, a Christian missionary, or what have you,
Hmm.
or even interacting with a Jew. They would immediately realize that their two, mythologies are compatible.
Hmm.
The syncretism between your ancestral creator deity and the creator deity of Genesis 1 is very easy because they're doing very similar things already.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy for you to be like, okay, yeah, we can agree, we can agree on the cosmology without agreeing on Moses and Abraham or any of that other business. But on the cosmology, we can agree. So that right there is a very compelling explanation for why the prophet's opponents, the mushrikeen, are able to how do you call it? Uh, uh, yeah, why they seem so close to Muhammad without necessarily assuming that they're already monotheists. But there's something that complicates it.
Right. I think that you have found that a great deal of the work had already been done through just internal transformations in Arabia, that the
Yes.
groundwork had been laid, right?
Yes.
And that this is perhaps much less of a rupture than that introduced by the Christians in Roman society, which,
Yes.
it had its sort of philosophers who, had developed parallel systems of quasi-monotheistic thought and who could engage with Christians about that,
Yes.
but who also interestingly rejected things like the resurrection. Um,
Absolutely.
this is exactly the point where the philosophers laugh at St. Paul when he speaks to them in Athens, is when he starts talking about the resurrection. They're like, okay, buddy.
Yes, 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 of course. Yeah. And so
um,
that's the same thing in the Quran. Yes, absolutely.
right. But the rest of Roman society, I don't think was. Yeah, I mean, Christian scholarship has tried to reverse engineer, this kind of decline of Roman paganism in order to make Christianity make sense. But I think it's all just, they've just reversed the terms of the equation. I don't
Right. Well,
that.
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, and now we don't believe that. I mean, for 30 years now, we think that paganism is really vibrant in the Roman
Yeah.
Empire. Has come
Yeah.
along.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you seem
Absolutely.
to be in a different, yeah.
Yeah. I would say in Arabia, the transform. So basically, you have these ancestral Arabian practitioners of ancestral Arabian religion who have a creator God, Allah, who created the world in a way that's very similar to the Bible that their neighbors are using or are deriving stories from. Now, you are surrounded by empire that's monotheistic, right? You don't necessarily need to be a Christian or a Jew to realize that it's popular now to worship the creator deity.
Hmm.
That the
Right,
creator deity is the
right.
is the guy that you're going to worship.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is it. This is really it. The creator deity is the one. And I think that that's enough to motivate the focusing on Allah as the main object of worship, just because everyone else is worshiping the creator. And then you can find other places for your other deities. That's fine.
Yeah.
But it's the creator that you're going to worship now, which in ancient times you didn't worship the creator.
Yeah.
right? But pagans influenced by, or let's say, and practitioners of ancient Arabian religion, and influenced by, Jews in the south, Jews next to them, Christians in the north, they will then say, okay, we worship the creator deity as well. And that is what we see in the inscriptions. The inscriptions are all invoking Allah.
Mm.
The public invocation of other deities or other super beings, let's just call them super beings to be neutral, the public invocation of those guys actually became unpopular. I think that they were there. We see them in the onomasticon still, whatever that would mean. We
Hmm.
see them in the Quran. The Quran mentions them. I mean, it says their opponents seem to be venerating these three goddesses somehow. What they mean by goddess is unclear, but still, these three beings. But it was just not chic anymore to publicly invoke them in inscriptions,
Yeah.
right? You invoke the creator. That's the main guy. And so you look at trends like that, I think is what's happening. And what you end up with is that it's always syncretism. There's nothing that isn't syncretism, right? Everything is syncretic. But it's one that doesn't as you said, it's not a huge rupture. It's a process. So what Muhammad's project introduced and what's being introduced in the Quran is a universe in which these other is basically consolidating the final remnants of power from all of these super beings into Allah himself.
Yeah.
That's it, right? You get rid of the intercessors, you get rid of these things. I don't know if it means they don't exist anymore or not. I mean, we can because the jinn, they don't get rid of the jinn. So the jinn, these are these fire spirits that the ancient Arabs believed in. And I have a new inscription, the first real witness, I think, to their veneration in pagan times, but we'll get to that we'll see what we do with that. But the jinn are not, it's not that the jinn don't exist, right? Muhammad's intervention, the jinn are
Right.
not there in the Bible, in the Christianity or Judaism. Muhammad's intervention did not eliminate this category of ancestral Arabian super being. Rather, there is a chapter in the Quran called the chapter of the jinn, and you can see how the world is there's a recalibration. So the chapter begins with the jinn, the words of a jinn, basically saying there was a company of jinn, and they heard someone reciting to the Quran, and so that they became Muslim after they heard this. The jinn became
Mhm.
Muslim, and then what goes next? What they start doing is relinquishing all of their powers. So they say, for example, we used to go up to we used to go up into the heavens to eavesdrop on the divine council so that they could know the future. But whoever goes there now will find waiting for them fierce guards with flames. So they can't do it anymore.
Um,
They can't go and get information about the future anymore. And then they basically say to mankind, we no longer know if good is intended for anyone on earth or whether their Lord intends to them, or if evil is intended for anyone on earth or whether their Lord intends for them good. In other words, we don't know fortunes anymore.
yeah.
So the way this kind of this universe was monotheized was not by saying the jinn didn't exist and getting rid of
Right.
this magical power, is
Right.
taking away their powers.
Or our evil demons or whatever. You just strip them
Yes,
of their power
you
and
stripped them of their power,
yeah.
and now only God
Yeah.
knows
Yeah.
the fates. The jinns can't help you anymore.
Yeah, you
And
use
so
them for literature maybe or
yes, yeah, you use yeah, they're all kinds,
yeah,
but you
yeah,
can't. So they have no power anymore, which is incredible. It's a wonderful process to see.
yeah.
Um, and I think that that's a kind of I don't I mean maybe I'm sure somebody has said that before. I don't know where because I haven't read the literature on this particular surah, but that just kind of stands out to me of how that world is monotheized, right?
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, that did not happen in the Roman Empire. It would have, in a certain sense, been delightful to have, Apollo and Aphrodite still exist, but kind of sort of stripped of it, sort of their divine powers. There's some movies where they survive into the present and just have to cope um, as sort of quasi-powerful mortals. Ahmad, I
Yes.
can't tell you how fascinating all of this is. Just the glimpses into this world that we thought was lost, that your work is providing. There's tremendous payoff from enduring the oven. Um,
It's a
those.
pleasure, really, to be honest with you.
But I
I
know
love it.
I can always sense the excitement in your voice when you're presenting this material, and I'm envious that you get to because we keep just chewing over the same old sources for the most part, in my field. But it's wonderful that you're making these discoveries, and I think you've given our listeners it, not just teasers, but a real sense of where your research is going, but enough to, I hope, interest more of them in reading more about this. So I'll put some information on the
Thank you.
episode description that will lead them to your work. And I look forward to reading. I mean, I read the article in draft, so thank you for sending that, and I hope it appears soon. One last question, so what is your dream inscription? If you were sort of wandering around
Wow.
there and you're looking at what would be an inscription that you would like pay real money for, as it were?
Well, yeah. So as scientists, we shouldn't want to we shouldn't want specific results.
Sure.
But I'll tell you something that's interesting to me. We have a lot of writing even at the time of the prophet. Now, here's the thing. Nabonidus, king of Babylon, when he came into Arabia and he conquered a huge part of North Arabia, he left inscriptions, but also people witnessing his conquests left inscriptions about him. Nabonidus, people who were part of his entourage. It
Mm.
was a huge event and people commemorated it. Abraha, centuries and centuries later, Abraha in the 6th century, he's the Ethiopian king of Yemen, Himyar. He launches an expedition to conquer Arabia Deserta. There are inscriptions about him,
Hmm.
even his own signature. But there are inscriptions about him. Abraha was, the royal inscriptions that he put up, but evidence that he was going around everywhere. It was a big event. There's a Ghassanid king Al Harith. This
Yes.
guy has inscriptions about him. He was in North Arabia. There's even Saudi Arabia inscription about Harith ordering a stone, a milestone. He's
Yeah.
mentioned, I think, in at least 3 texts now. At the moment, of course, our data are incomplete. But Muhammad was a conqueror of Arabia.
Yes.
Where are the people who witnessed this?
Right.
I would love to see an inscription that's actually witnessing these events.
Right. That's fair enough. And that's not
Muhammad's army came by, Muhammad was, anything like that, right?
yes,
Anything
yes.
talking about the prophet. I wrote this the year the prophet came to the city.
Yes.
So it was an event. His activities, his political military activities were at a larger scale, perhaps, than all of the people that I've mentioned before.
And that's not a case of, violating the scientific principle of not desiring specific results because you don't know what that inscription will say. It could say anything,
No,
but so long
no,
as
it
it's
could.
talking about that event. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But a witness to his political project, indeed,
Fascinating.
right? Maybe it's there. Everything could be there. The landscapes are huge. There's so much to discover. I'll end with this, just sort of something to keep the listener aware, because these are not landscapes that many people get to explore. I've given a lecture before where somebody asked me about Christianity and the Hijaz, and I said, well, we don't have, I mean, there's the inscription, the documented record is incomplete. And the person responded to me, he said, well, no, I mean, it's been surveyed. It's been surveyed.
Right.
And what we are talking about is a landmass roughly the size of India. And we are talking about small groups of people, teams,
Yes,
handfuls of teams for 2 weeks at a time, 3 weeks at a time in a year, wandering around a couple of kilometers.
yes, yes, yes.
No, it has not been surveyed.
Yes, get some more
And
postdocs. You can survey India.
oh yeah, there is much to learn still. And so
Uh,
there's a lot to discover indeed. Yeah.
Ahmad, thank you so much for your work and for coming on. It was
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. And when you find that inscription, I will know and I will have you back on.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye. Yeah.